like this. Better now, better. Okay, good morning, everybody, and thanks very much for being here. We welcome you all. We've got a full day and really a wonderful group of witnesses before us, the first of which, Dr. Zucker, is here. So Governor Ridge and I will make some brief opening statements, then we'll go right to it. And our big challenge today will be to control ourselves from not having this hearing go until 9 or 10 p.m. tonight, because we've got great witnesses. This Blue Ribbon study panel on biodefense was organized and is now housed here at the Hudson Institute, which is our sponsor, to deal with two forms of biological threats to the American people. One is bioterrorist attacks, that is the use of biological weapons to attack the United States. And the second, related because what is necessary for prevention, certainly for response and treatment is detection is quite similar, and that is naturally occurring biological diseases that can become pandemics. Recent events demonstrate how willing malevolent actors are to use weapons that were, according to international law, banned decades ago. The recent unfortunate, tragic, high-profile poisoning of a former KGB agent, Sergei Skripal, and his daughter Yulia, presumably by agents of the Russian government, is probably the most visible recent event that could be called a biological attack. Poison does continue to be used by nation states, by terrorists and criminals to achieve the same goal, which is to strike at adversaries and also to evoke terror in the general population. Some of these poisoning attacks are discovered by medical, public health, law enforcement, intelligence, or military personnel before they're implemented, or certainly fully implemented, but many more are not discovered in time because of inadequate surveillance and detection. Most of the poisonings our panel has examined, no matter the type or perpetrator of agent used, have been transnational. That is, they have gone over national boundaries, and that's the subject of today's meeting, which is transnational threats and global security. We've not yet figured out, I'm afraid, how to prevent or deter these sorts of actions, but I'm hopeful that global efforts to improve surveillance, detection, and attribution will help. And I look forward to hearing about some of these from a really impressive group of witnesses that we have today. The other side of this, another transnational threat that we're going to focus on, is infectious disease pandemics. And it's appropriate and fitting that we're doing that because, as I'm sure most of you in the room know, this is the 100th anniversary of the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. It's hard to get exact numbers on the fatalities, but I've seen numbers that say it's at least 50 million died in that pandemic, and maybe as many as 100 million. And if I may be personal, and my colleagues on the panel have heard me say this, my paternal grandmother died in that flu epidemic in New York. My father was 3 years old. He had no memories of her, and of course I never knew her. And when I think about we're just one of 50 million of the extent to which her early death from this affected my father and our family, and you just multiply it, the consequences are really disastrous. While that biological event occurred a century ago, we've not yet overcome the ability of influenza viruses to sicken and kill a lot of people. The poultry industry and the connection of animal health to human health is really quite striking to me, and one of the things that I've most learned in my work on this panel. The poultry industry has taken multiple hits over the past few years, with many countries, including our own, having had to cull tens of thousands, really ultimately hundreds of thousands of poultry to prevent the spread of avian influenza. And the rate of the H3.2 infection was 4 times greater than H1N1 was in 2009, and we thought that was a pandemic. Last year's flu vaccine, just to put this in context, which most of us had, that is, we had the vaccine, was only 42% effective, I gather, because of one vaccine strain mutation that resulted from the old egg-based manufacturing process we still use today for vaccines. So there, too, we need more work, and we need it quickly. With the threat of pandemic influenza foremost in our minds, we know that many other diseases currently do and could produce pandemics. Again, working with Governor Ridge and the other members of the panel, I've learned a lot in this. I recently spent some time with a doctor who focuses on malaria, and by coincidence, today has been declared World Malaria Day by the World Health Organization. But the doctor said to me that, and maybe Dr. Zucker, you can validate or tell me these numbers are wrong, that every year there are 200 million people who get malaria, and there are probably 500,000 who die from it every year. Despite our basically having eradicated malaria here in the United States, our country still deals with thousands of cases of malaria in travelers every year. So it remains a pandemic. In some, we're not just talking today about diseases that affect humans and animals. I want to add that Dr. Stack from Kansas State University is going to be discussing the danger and threat of wheat blast. Wheat blast pandemic that moved quickly throughout the world would be devastating to our economies, but also to our societies in general. These are serious problems that are transnational. They're truly global. A point that I know Dr. Osterholm, our keynote lunch speaker, will address, and we look forward to hearing him. America needs to better prepare for sure, but we have an interest in seeing that other countries prepare as well, because of the extent to which we're interacting so much more than we did in 1918 with people from around the world to our benefit. But there is risk in that when an infectious disease is spreading. And of course, international agencies also have a role to play. That's why we're very glad to have Colonel Terry Taylor here, and look forward to his discussion about what the United Nations can do as a part of this. As I said, we got a first-rate group of speakers today, witnesses, if you will, who will help us fulfill the responsibility that this panel has taken on and accepted, which is to oversee and monitor existing biological threats and act to make recommendations to the public and private sector about how to improve our defenses against those threats before it's too late. So we're here to learn, and then we're here to be advocates, hopefully constructive advocates. It's been a real honor to work on this panel now for the last few years, and one of the great honors is to co-chair it with a dear friend and a great public servant, Governor Tom Ridge. Governor?
Thank you, Senator. I echo your comments with regard to our colleagues on the panel. I thank all of you for joining us this morning. The Senator talked a lot about transnational biological threats and pandemics. I'd like to share just a couple of thoughts with you about the threat from nation-states. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that today as well. Way back when, several years ago, when our panel first started, we referred to three specific types of biological threats: naturally occurring, accidentally released, and intentionally introduced. And when it came to intentionally introduced, we generally focused on bioterrorism. After a few months, though, it became clear that we needed to emphasize the threat from both terrorists and nation states. We looked at the State Department's assessments regarding compliance with the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention and saw that 1 year the State Department said they were worried about China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, and Syria. And then a year or two later, only Russia made the list. Personally, I don't quite understand how the others became immune from that list. Forgive me one editorial comment. I suspect that, like a lot of other international treaties and conventions, when some of our foes sign them, there's no intent to comply. As a matter of fact, before the ink is even dry, they continue to use, for whatever nefarious purposes they've designed these systems, an absolute abandonment of whatever principles around some of these international conventions. Now, I know that's the assessment they use is very strong over at the State Department, and I suspect that these countries will be back on again shortly. But a few days ago, General Dunford, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, spoke at a press conference and said that reminded us that we had bombed the Syrian Scientific Research Center because it was known to be researching, developing, producing, and testing both chemical and biological weapons. Obviously, with that information, I would hope that the State Department would put Syria back on the list. One of the other countries you have to be worried about is North Korea. It's pretty clear when the supreme leader, Kim Jong-un, is walking around, he's touring some of those labs. There was a photo with him showing the world the shiny new dual-use equipment in one of his labs. It would certainly be used to produce biological agents as well. And obviously, we can't afford to downplay North Korea's role, not just in the nuclear world, but in potentially with a transnational biological threat. I think the time for assuming that nation states and terrorist organizations are not involved in developing biological weapons is over. Somewhat, again, an editorial comment, I think it's somewhat naive to think some of these countries would have abandoned them to start with. So we're looking forward to Ken Luongo's thoughts on biological weapons nonproliferation later this morning, and Alan Rudolph's views on biological threat reduction this afternoon. We noted as well that our new National Security Director, John Bolton, takes the biological threat as seriously as this panel does. We look forward to the White House finishing and releasing the National Biodefense Strategy. It's part of the recommendations that the Commission has made. We had hoped to have it completed by the end of last year. We know they're working on it. We still have not, we think there's some momentum there. We're still looking for the finished product. And we got a couple other speakers, Dr. James Lawler and Beth Cameron, former White House staffers, perhaps can shed some light on the challenges that our friends in the White House who are committed to the strategy are confronted with in order to pull that all together. This is a good day. This is a good day because we have a variety of great speakers with excellent credentials and much and important words to share. And I say to Dr. Zucker and to those that succeed you, one of the reasons this panel, I believe, has gained so much credibility and traction on the Hill is that the recommendations we've made have been based upon the learnings and experiences and observations made by the men and women from in this area who have testified before us over the past couple of years. This list of the speakers we have today just adds to that credibility. Now, our first speaker, Dr. Zucker, a marvelous career. I could give you a snapshot of the bio. This is the quality of the people we have before us. Multiple degrees, medical degree, legal degrees, HHS, World Health Organization, Commissioner of Health in New York, multiple trips to different parts of the world on very specific medical, dealing with very specific medical matters. We think it's great to have him leading off as our first speaker today in this panel dealing with transnational biological threats and global security. Doctor, welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here and to speak before you. vantage point of Oh, there we go. Sorry. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I will approach this from the standpoint of managing an infectious disease outbreak, and particularly what we've done in New York on several of these cases. This is a more of a high-level view of some of these issues, and it's a little bit on the creative side as well for morning. So it all begins in one place, one person, one infection, and if it's serious enough, one death. In the case of H5N1 or bird flu, it was 1997 in Hong Kong. With the anthrax crisis, as we all know, it was 2001 in Florida. And in the case of SARS in 2002 in the Guangdong province of southern China. With H1N1, 2009 in California, and with Ebola, 2013 as well in Western Africa, and Zika in 2016 in Brazil. And from these locations, the diseases and the threats spread: Washington, D.C., Toronto, Cambodia, Egypt, Indonesia, Thailand, Taiwan, Singapore, Vietnam, Mexico, New Zealand, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Spain, Mali, and Brazil most recently. In public health, the question becomes, whose job is it to spot an outbreak? Whose job is it to treat it and to stop it? And is it the local authorities, the local and county health departments? Is it the state or in other parts of the world, the provinces? Is it the federal government? Or one might think it's an international matter. The truth is that an infectious disease outbreak is everyone's business. And it belongs to the World Health Organization, it belongs to the Health and Human Services Department, the White House, CDC, FEMA, belongs to Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, the 50 health departments in our country, the county health departments, and the local health departments. And it also belongs to Doctors Without Borders and Gates Foundation, the International Red Cross, Project Hope, Oxfam, the International Medical Corps, and so many other NGOs that are working in the area of public health. And it belongs to the health departments of any individual nation as well as their local public health authorities. And from there, we move forward to the entire global health community, which has a hands-on approach to infectious disease outbreaks, controlling it and spreading it. In this slide, the CDC seems to be an outlier there because CDC is usually in multiple places at one time. In our highly globalized world, we know it could be a matter of just hours before an infectious disease in one corner of the world winds up here in our backyard, and we need an all-hands-on-deck approach to this. The most effective public health response are those that involve local, state, national, and international partners working together. Exactly how they play out depends on the disease, what's happening, and how the outbreak is evolving. As much as this is science, there's an art to managing an infectious disease outbreak as well, and especially when an outbreak is on an international level like Ebola or SARS or Zika and the multiple flus that we've experienced in recent years, particularly this past year's flu season, which was quite significant. At every stage of an outbreak, there are three vital overarching tasks that we must approach: clinical management, treating the sick and preventing illness in the exposed; consequence management, preserving public health and safety and minimizing the consequences of an outbreak; and communications management, relying on a cohesive and consistent message about the outbreak without inciting unnecessary fear and anxiety. The burden of the first task, clinical management, initially falls on the local authorities in most cases, often with the help of local healthcare providers. I'll mention this in a second. It's up to them to report the infectious disease to state authorities and then work with the providers on the front line to safely diagnose and treat it. And once a sentinel case of an infectious disease is detected, local authorities put the providers on alert to watch for others, and healthcare facilities assess, triage, patient screening algorithms come about, and much more. And then they have to treat the sick. They need to avoid the chaos that can occur. Healthcare facilities may see a surge of potentially infectious patients and a need for surge capacity. At the same time, local health departments and officials also have to prevent illness in those who were exposed, be it with antibiotics, antivirals, or vaccines. New York State has dealt with a great number of these over the past 6 months to a year. We've dealt with hepatitis A, hepatitis C, mumps, measles, meningitis, and flu. Some of these are not transnational, although I have to tell you the meningitis case and some of the measles cases, including the other day, were coming from, one was from Australia and one was from Europe, so we've seen this as well. Having been on the front line in some of these cases, whether it was anthrax years ago and SARS, bird flu, Ebola, Zika, the clinical management in action is very important, and how our federal partners help out. As we all recall, with anthrax, we were obviously on heightened alert, as that was after September 11th, shortly thereafter. Local health officials and private physicians didn't wait for CDC information. Local authorities also closed office buildings when the first victims were exposed, and then there was all the issues of post-exposure prophylaxis. HHS worked closely with the District of Columbia to initiate the nation's largest ever mass medication program, handing out over 17,000 medications to 17,000 people. The local response is critical for containing an outbreak. In response to SARS, countries like Vietnam and city-states like Singapore rapidly initiated strategies to identify and isolate persons who fit the case definition and were able to trace and quarantine their contacts and contain the spread of disease. A delayed response in China made it difficult to conduct contact tracing. As for H1N1, New York State Department of Health engaged stakeholders. From many agencies, we had 58 local health departments involved, 145 hospitals outside of New York City, 946 pharmacies, 23 federal qualified health centers, and 1,152 long-term care facilities. 6 million H1N1 vaccines were received and 1.7 million were vaccinated. What about Ebola? As you recall, the local response in Guinea was highly flawed with Ebola because it originated in a country with a very troubled healthcare infrastructure, which makes things difficult. It was a shortcoming that led to the nation's largest Ebola, the history's largest Ebola outbreak. And that specific region had never experienced Ebola before in that region. However, other deadly diseases with similar presentations were endemic to that region of Africa, like cholera and malaria. Investigating an outbreak requires balancing existing knowledge against the possibility of something new, which didn't happen in that scenario. When a 2-year-old boy in Guinea came down with fever, vomiting, and diarrhea and black stools and died 2 days later, it didn't exactly set off the alarm bells, nor did the death of his sister or his mother, or his grandmother, a family friend, until ultimately it was 3 months later when the little boy's death, when things started to spiral out of control and international public health officials realized they had a serious crisis on their hands. That gave the virus months to elude investigators and spread. It might have been a different story if the case erupted here in the United States, and we surely hope in New York that it would be different in New York. In New York, our healthcare infrastructure is much stronger than in some parts of the, many parts of the world, most parts of the world. We have sophisticated medical centers. We have highly trained physicians. We have well-equipped labs that are working, and we rely on them to send reportable diseases to the local health departments. Our Wadsworth lab works diligently with so many others, and I'll talk about that in a minute. In New York, the counties, which include the city of New York, obviously, are required to report any suspicious disease activity to the state. We use the Communicable Disease Electronic Surveillance System. We use the Electronic Clinical Lab Reporting System to enhance surveillance. Reporting of suspected cases is mandated under New York State public health law. We look for the resources of the infection. We work to identify and contact people who may need prophylaxis so we can stop the disease from spreading. If there's an outbreak, local and state health departments take preventive action. We saw this in New York City when we had the first case of Ebola. Long before the patient arrived home in October of 2014, the city and state were laying the groundwork for this. We had protocols in place for transporting a patient. We had protocols in place for safe lab testing and protocols for monitoring contacts. That's what made for the smooth handling of that first case. Even after the patient arrived, New York City continued to monitor the 114 healthcare workers who had cared for them. The state has additional responsibilities. Let me share what we did. Much like other states, New York State provides staff support. The state takes a greater or lesser role depending on how well the local health departments are managing the outbreak and how far it spreads. If it spreads far enough, state and local health departments will activate their incident management system. And like most states, New York also provides technical expertise and lab testing to determine how individual cases are related. The federal government was keenly aware of what was happening, and we all know that when it becomes an issue of national security, large outbreaks of this nature, bioterrorism, as you're talking about today, our federal partners are pulled in immediately. We might need their expertise on rare diseases like Ebola, and we might need their help with PCR testing. When it came to Ebola and Zika as well, New York worked closely with the CDC. And we asked CDC staff to come to New York site visits to assist with the investigation of Ebola. But the CDC needs our expertise as well. CDC asked our state public health lab, the Wadsworth Lab, to help handling and testing for our neighboring states during the Zika crisis. Our lab upstate is well known nationally as well as internationally. CDC used our hospital review process to inform the national process that they used to designate Ebola treatment centers. The truth is, it is a mutually dependent relationship when it comes to managing a disease outbreak. Large public health crises can quickly become multi-agency responses that require coordination across many agencies. It's never the total responsibility of one agency or one layer of government. The clinical management of an outbreak by a city, state, federal officials is very much intertwined. They use our knowledge and we use theirs. More recently, in 2016, we responded to the Zika epidemic. The World Health Organization declared Zika a public health emergency of international concern due to the emerging clusters of microcephaly cases. The first reported case of locally acquired Zika were made in August of 2016 in the states of Florida and Texas. With no vaccine or medication available, we responded promptly and with great efficiency. Okay, so next, the second part is the consequence management. Managing consequences means working to protect public health and safety, restore government services, and provide emergency relief. And again, it's a task that everyone shares, but from a different vantage point. The ultimate goal is to stem the spread of the disease. In the aftermath of 9/11, when we were on high alert for bioterrorism, those of us in the federal government heard a lot from the states. Everyone contacted HHS asking for strategies on what to do about a bioterrorist attack. I know others will speak about this later today. Before that, few thoughts about terrorism or bioterrorism the way we do now. In fact, 20 years ago, I suspect if 8 people got sick in a restaurant, we'd automatically think it was food poisoning. And today, we would wonder, could this be a terrorist at work? But all the worrying led to a lot of preparedness and planning. And we realized this is a mutually dependent relationship, a two-way street. Most states have well-rehearsed strategies for dealing with a public health crisis. They can do a lot to stop the spread of infectious disease. They can quarantine someone who might be sick and even force them to accept treatment. They can make major decisions about large crowds, like canceling a sporting event or arena concert. They can call up the National Guard to help manage transportation security. In the anthrax scare, we know we pondered some of these questions. How do we contact people who have been exposed? When do we reopen the Capitol? How long do we keep the post office shut down? Whatever we do, our decisions can have marked political as well as financial repercussions. So what did we do with Ebola in 2014 or Zika in 2016? Before Ebola got to New York, the governor granted me the authority to issue a commissioner's order. The orders detailed exactly how hospitals, clinics, funeral homes, healthcare workers, and emergency services would handle Ebola. This was a big issue. We spelled out exactly how ambulances would safely transport a patient. It detailed exactly how we remove waste from a patient's hospital room, and it spelled out precisely how we'd safely handle lab specimens. The commissioner's orders allowed me to take immediate action without going through a tedious process to address violations of laws or regulations. If the situation escalates, the state may need to control the outbreak, and clearly at that point, what ends up happening, we need to bring in our federal partners. With HHS comes additional resources and expertise. As the federal government, CDC, FDA, NIH, specifically NIAID, views this as a national perspective. It helps us regionally. I see the most important role of the federal government to provide guidance, ideally expeditiously implementing one message for all affected jurisdictions during a communicable disease outbreak is beneficial. The feds, as we know, can impose travel restrictions, as they did when they urged U.S. residents to avoid non-essential travel to Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia because of Ebola. They can stop foreigners from entering the country if they have a communicable disease that threatens public health. And as we know, when an event overwhelms the state or local responses, the president can invoke the Stafford Act, which declares natural or man-made catastrophes as well as pandemic flus and communicable diseases a major disaster or emergency. And it lets the state governors ask the president to declare emergency. Either way, the act unleashes a cascade of billions of dollars to help meet the needs of the state and local governments. So in March of 2016, within a month and a half of the World Health Organization's declaration regarding Zika, Governor Cuomo announced the New York State Department of Health's 6-step plan for a Zika action plan. In fact, we were working on this plan in December of 2015 when we first heard of the concerns that were emanating from Brazil. New York State's response to Zika included coordination between the governor's office, the Department of Health, the Department of Environmental Conservation, and the State Emergency Management. The 6-point plan included eliminating mosquito breeding sites, monitoring of the Aedes mosquito with special trapping and testing. To date, no mosquito pools have been tested positive for Zika in New York. Distributing over 20,000 Zika protection kits for pregnant women to healthcare providers. Deploying Zika rapid response teams, which were made up of over 100 staff members. Issuing emergency regulations requiring all local health departments to submit action plans, and launching a major public health awareness campaign, which resulted in us responding to over 8,700 Zika-related calls from the public. In all, New York State communicated with providers and local health departments. We issued emergency regulations requiring all local health departments to submit plans. And in essence, this is truly a dance of power, a dance of authority. If you have a rapidly spreading contagious infectious disease, you've got more than a national emergency. You do have an international one. And as the WHO calls it, public health emergency of international concern. And for H5N1, we had an opportunity, at least I had an opportunity to look at this from HHS and WHO. Let's look at it from the WHO side. WHO is clearly not a governmental agency, but it can make resolutions, it can write treaties, and through the international health regulations, it can impose regulatory action. In fact, the IHR is the only legally binding global agreement that involves 194 countries, including all members of the WHO. It provides a broad mandate with the following goal: to prevent, protect, and I quote, to prevent, protect against, control, and provide a public health response to the international spread of disease in ways that are commensurate with and restricted to public health risks and which avoid unnecessary interference with international traffic and trade. Probably took several months to write that. Having worked at the WHO, I'm sure this took a while. That actually is the sealing of the United Nations in Geneva, that piece of artwork. The IHR spells out exactly when a nation must report a disease, which involves 4 criteria. Does the event have a serious public health impact? Is the event unusual, unexpected? Is it at risk of spreading internationally? Is there a potential for international spread or travel restrictions? If the answer is yes to 2 of these questions, countries are required to notify the WHO. The IHR has a list of diseases that must be scrutinized closely with a protocol. That's cholera, viral hemorrhagic fever like Ebola, yellow fever, and West Nile, and those are among that category. But they also have a list of diseases that must be reported even if there's just 1 case, and that's the next list. SARS, new influenza viruses, wild-type polio, and obviously smallpox, if hopefully it'll never come back. In fact, it was the SARS outbreak that led to the revisions of the original IHR, which only covered cholera, plague, yellow fever, and smallpox before its eradication. Countries don't have to know the source or cause of an outbreak to report it to WHO. The goal is early detection and a public health response before disease spreads internationally. And then it's up to the Director General of WHO to determine if the event is a public health emergency of international concern. Since the IHR's update in 2005, we had 4 public health emergencies at that level: H1N1 in 2009, in 2014 the wild polio virus and Ebola, and 2016 Zika. When an outbreak gets to this point, the IHR requires WHO to work with the countries to develop a public health response. And that includes providing information to the public, which leads us to the third and the last major task of any infectious disease outbreak. What are we going to do to tell the 325 million Americans about the infectious disease outbreak when it comes to communication? What are we going to tell the 25 million people who watch the nightly news? What are we going to tell the nation's 1,300 daily newspapers? And what message will the 303,000 public health workers convey? We also have 2.2 billion Facebook users who ask about an outbreak. Communication has to happen early, the message has to be crisp and clear, and its communications really comes down to trust. The public needs to know that they can trust the person telling them the information. The information has to be clear and concise. Without good communication, there's mixed messages, and we've all seen this. People need to know that the information is coming from a reliable source. It's important that the public health authorities at every level report fully and accurately anything about that they know about the outbreak. Open and honest communication needs to be there while explaining why some details must remain undisclosed. And they must listen to the public's concern, their confusion, and objections so that the communications becomes a dialogue, not just a one-way conversation. That's the communication that creates order. That's why I'm proud to say New York always aims to do this and tries to and does. Though I experienced the challenges during my communications with the press during a local Legionella outbreak several years back. However, in Ebola, with our partners, which include the Greater New York Hospital Association, we hosted an Ebola information session with healthcare workers. We heard their concerns and their fears, and we responded. The goal in outbreak communication isn't just about controlling the outbreak. It's about considering the impact on people working in hospitals, kids in school and in college, and travelers from other countries. Bad information can lead to anxiety and fear, as we know, and social disruption clearly hampers any efforts to control an outbreak. One of the biggest challenges is that everyone works on a different clock. The press moves at one speed, politics moves at another, and public health at a third speed. As we know, it takes a certain amount of time for bacteria to grow or for viruses to spread. But that time is very different from the time a reporter needs to post a blog, for a politician to reach out to the constituents, for a health department to issue an alert. Recall that during anthrax and bird flu, we primarily used cell phones and emails to communicate. During Ebola, it was texts, and with Zika, information was being conveyed by tweets. So in conclusion, every outbreak is different. Every response is different. The job of the public health professional across America is to protect the people who make up this great nation. As New York's health commissioner, it's my job to oversee the health and the safety of 20 million residents. Whenever and wherever the next outbreak is, one thing we know, vigilance and collaboration is key. The reality is preventing and monitoring and managing an outbreak is a 24-hour a day, 365 days a year job, and it happens at every level, local, state, provincial, national, international. And working together, we can be prepared to stay on top of this. It is truly the only way for hope to be successful in this. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today.
Thanks, Doctor. That was great. Was that last slide, was it OI?
Oi, yes.
Yeah,
yes, it was
okay,
oi.
good. I mean, it didn't stand, it wasn't initial standing, it was an expletive.
Yes, it was us.
Yeah, thank you. That's one of the greatest PowerPoint presentations I've ever seen. I feel as if you've not only taught me a lot, you've taken me to a great art museum
Thank
along
you.
the way. We've got probably a little more than 20 minutes of questioning. If we keep on schedule, I'm just going to limit myself to one. I was interested in your really impressive biography that you have taught biosecurity law at Georgetown. So I wanted to ask you if there are one or two specific recommendations you would make for changing biosecurity law, either at the federal or state level.
I think that that's a great question. I think, as mentioned, that we have some great laws in place here. My concern sometimes is, and what I've noticed in the state, is that some of the public health laws in some states vary from one area to another, and whether there could be better collaboration across the states on some of these issues. And granted, the federal government can step in and obviously has the key, the Stafford Act and other things that they can utilize. But I have found that sometimes when we're working in one of these issues, whether we can work better with our neighboring states.
Okay, that's really an interesting idea, and one that we've not dealt with in our group, so we'll take that seriously, which is to establish some kind of multi-state compact or try to blend the laws. So, because obviously we're focused on transnational threats, there's clearly trans-state threats. People are moving.
I mean, I noticed this, although it's not a biosecurity issue, but with the opioid epidemic.
Yeah.
And we work with other commissioners in the area in northeastern part of the United States. And there's variabilities in between what one state and another state is doing, and these really do cross over. And I recognized also when we were dealing with Ebola as well.
And that inhibited your ability to do everything you wanted to do in New York, I take it.
Well, we try to push forward, and obviously in New York, but granted, someone will travel from one area to another,
Sure.
And some of the things we're trying to do on opioids is a little bit more of a regional area.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful. Governor?
Yeah, thank you. Doctor, at the outset, you talked about roles and responsibilities. How do we identify it? How do we identify that biological threat? How do we stop it in its place? How do we treat people? And then how do we reduce the impact in the broader community? And I thought about you and your role, and I thought in New York, and I thought about New York City, and then I think about San Francisco and LA and Miami. We have major metropolitan areas that are international points of entry. What are the lessons learned or the mechanisms used in New York City, where you got people from all over the world flooding into well, not all the parts of the world, but most parts of the world, flooding into the city? What are the elements you use or the mechanisms used to spot these potential problems from the international population that rushes to New York?
So this becomes a very much about collaboration. So in the state, obviously, we have the Port Authority, which falls under the governor, and the MTA, which falls under the governor, working with the city, and we also have working with some of the issues of transportation. So I think some of the ways to spot it is increased vigilance, and I go back to the issues with Ebola because that was a great example where we were dealing with the international airports, JFK, but also Newark and our neighboring state, and to sort of figure out how we can identify individuals. What we did at that point was we set up the federal government, also CDC, had a center at the airport, but we also had a center at the airport to monitor people if there was any concern that came through. And then we worked closely with the local community, both the city and all of our other counties in the state, to try to figure out if somebody came back from one of those regions, how would we monitor them, and to call and check on them on a regular basis.
As I understand, as commissioner, in response to Ebola, you developed a protocol among New York State hospitals?
Right. So,
and was each hospital, was that protocol embedded into every hospital, or did you have like centers of excellence or centers that were directed specifically to that threat?
So that's a very interesting question. We had 10 centers for Ebola. But and we worked closely with the hospital associations, both in the city as well as upstate. Then it comes back to back to law a little bit, because there are certain criteria in order to set up a place to treat Ebola patients. So some of the hospitals basically had 2 or 3 beds, and it was really quite labor intensive. One of the other things we did do with those for all hospitals was we called in all of the hospital workers and had a conference in the Javits Center, the large center, as I'm sure you know, in the city, for the hospital workers, because there was a great concern of the risk to those healthcare workers. And so we went through particularly about how to put on protective equipment. The challenge that I find that happens in these situations is that Ebola, even though it wasn't that long ago, the institutional memory and individuals' memory about what has to be done sort of starts to wane a little bit, because many other things have come along. So what we've asked is that the hospitals continue, particularly those 10 centers, to make sure that they continue to train individuals on a regular basis. The hospitals still have those centers there, and hopefully we'll never have another Ebola outbreak. But there may be something else that happens. And so, I've had an opportunity to go back to those areas and take a look at those facilities and to be sure that they're up to still up and operating. And they have been using them just for other things as well. So that's been very helpful.
Have you given thought, we recommended on the commission of a national biodefense health system. Not every hospital can be equipped to deal with all transnational biological threats, but take that model and build almost like centers of excellence to deal with biodefense nationally. Does that make any sense?
I mean, that would work. I mean, the hospitals, I have found some of the challenges for the hospitals are the bigger medical centers can sort of absorb some of this, but the worry that happened was that some of the hospitals were worried that if someone was to be treated in one of these hospitals, or if they had an infectious disease, the worry is that maybe other patients will say, well, I'm not going to that hospital, and that could impact on their bottom line a little bit. And so we recognize that and we're sensitive to that issue as well.
Okay, one final question. I don't mean to dominate this, but When you mentioned Ebola, it brought back to mind one of the briefings I had within the first couple of weeks I was in the White House before we even created the department. And one of the pathogens that the intelligence community was worried about was Ebola. Fast forward about 15 years. Back then, the intelligence community was worried about it. 15 years later, it reared its ugly, fatal head, and there was still some challenges associated with identifying and treating it. Someone in your position, with your experience, do you have access on a top secret basis to the intel community so that the 20 million citizens in New York know that you, in charge of their health care, have a relationship with intel and that they're worried about these particular pathogens? Do you have access to that?
I personally don't, but I assume, some of my superiors may.
Very good.
So on that.
I think it's critically important. I mean, for me, there was always a fundamental concern I had that 15 years lapsed between when the intel community said, hey, Tom, the country ought to be worried about that. 15 years later, we've got it, and people are still kind of scrambling to deal. Well, you came up, and you and the governor came up with a 6-point plan based on the emergency. Actually, you were anticipated, as I recall correctly.
Right.
But not everybody anticipates those things. So I just glad to know that you've got access to that information.
Thank you. Thanks, Governor. As commissions and panels go, this is one of the smaller ones that's ever been created. But if I may say, excluding myself, it's very high quality. So I'm going to ask my colleagues, 3 of whom are here. The only one who couldn't be here is former Congressman Jim Greenwood. And we have a back bench over there of real experts, too. But on this group, I'm going to ask you if you have a question or two, and we'll start with former Senate Majority Leader, my leader, Tom Daschle.
Well, thank you, Joe. Let me join my colleagues in complimenting you, Dr. Zucker, on a very impressive presentation, and I'm glad we have a printout of your PowerPoint, because I agree with Joe. The artwork especially was laudable. But I like the title, too, The Art of Managing Infectious Disease Outbreaks. And I want to be cognizant of our limited time. So I'd like to focus, if I could, just on the response aspects of management. And there are 2 in particular that I think are particularly challenging. And that is the management of information and the management around coordination. Information from past experience, I think, is one of the biggest frustrations in that with social media in particular, there is no control over what is said and who says it, and there's no real single authority on how we address the truth. And I think in these circumstances, truth and good information is critical to the success of response. So that's number 1. And number 2, you started with your presentation very effectively, in my view, by articulating that it's everyone's responsibility to do this. The problem is, I think as we look at the fact that it is everyone's responsibility, we tend to be siloed in looking at our responsibilities from a very narrow lens. You had a very impressive array of those agencies and authorities that are responsible. What I worry about is the lack of meaningful coordination at all levels, both international, national, and even local. So could you talk about both of those challenges, the information and how we effectively coordinate, and if possible, give us some thoughts on what we need to do in addition to what we're doing today to address those 2 concerns?
Senator, I think the point you make about social media and the information is something I've experienced in the course of the past 4 years as the commissioner. Things have been picking up a pace that's even faster, and every time we've had a situation, whether it was Ebola, we had a regional issue in Legionella, which was obviously not, it was primarily New York. And Zika, I've noticed that things have moved at a faster and faster pace. I think that this is one of those areas where we almost have to make sure the public is aware of what are reliable sources. We have reliable sources out there. We have the CDC. I mean, I have been pushing hard in New York, and I reach out to all the doctors and all the health professionals in the state on a monthly basis to make sure they realize that we have our websites, and that's where they should turn to information. my personal experience is I find many people, just as a physician, a lot of times people will call me and say, I looked up on Google and this is what I think I have. And it's like, well, when are you going to check with a real doctor and not Google? And so I think this is what the normal response is, that people do this and they go to look at things quickly. And I think that what we can do is to educate the public about these are the key sources for information, and that before you go looking somewhere else or listening to others, recognize that this is where the correct data is. Then there's the challenge also with communication about the fact that people want answers, as I mentioned, quickly, and they do turn to whether it's an email or a text. And some of biological systems move at a certain pace, and it's very hard to sort of try to explain to someone that it will take an extra 24 hours. And even some of the technologies we have with PCR, that doesn't really solve the problem. And I will just, as an aside, when we had the Legionella issue, the PCR will tell you that it was there. It doesn't mean it's alive or dead. It just says it was there, and we're going to still have to grow it. And sometimes it's an issue of communicating with the press and communicating with others on that. Regarding coordination, I think that this is, again, there are a lot of players involved, and I think that has exponentially increased. Years ago, there was a handful of international organizations, and everyone turned, obviously, to the federal government and to the state health labs and authorities. And now there's a lot of others involved in this, and I think that what can be done is to bring them around the table, and perhaps when there's the beginning of an outbreak, is to bring them all in. And maybe this is done, but to bring them all in and sit down and say, okay, what's everyone's role here? And we've seen this in whether it's an infectious disease outbreak, or we've seen this with disasters, natural disasters. I remember with Haiti, when and I was down there, after that, not right after, but months after, and even then, there were a lot of people involved, and I think that's one of the challenges that we have.
Well, I thank you. I won't belabor this, but I think we could carry on this conversation for some time. One of my frustrations is in with some of our recent experiences, we've actually had public officials who have not been accurate and who have, in some ways, even exacerbated the situation with rhetorical claims and with decisions and actions that I think made the problem even worse. So the more I think we can inoculate against that with this coordinated effort, anticipating that these circumstances are going to arise and ensuring that these people act and speak responsibly, I think could go a long way to start to address some of the challenges we face.
I remember, Senator, when we had the anthrax crisis, sitting in your office and the discussions around the table, and it wasn't sort of like, okay, someone's sending an email or a text. It was like, okay, how do we address this problem now? And let's figure this out. And that's what the approach was. Now I think things have moved much quicker than 17 years ago.
Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a really important exchange. Secretary Shalala, thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, Howard. It's nice to see you. I was interested that you didn't mention tuberculosis, and you've seen a bit of a spike in New York, and it is an infectious disease that can spread rapidly. New York dealt with it in '92, and in a classic public health case. Could you talk a little about TB, how concerned you are about it?
We are. The specifics and the data, as a matter of fact, I was looking some of this up, and I said, I don't think I'm going to have the time to get this into the slides. But I was looking up because we have seen an increase in tuberculosis cases, and we've also do have the case, some of those scenarios which we had 15, 20 years ago. We are trying to we're trying to work on increasing education about this issue. It is a challenge for us. It goes back to sort of people coming into the country and how are we monitoring and checking for this, and to be sure people are safe. And I recognize that this is one of the other issues. So I don't have a specific answer for you, but I will look into what we're doing. But I do know New York City has been seeing an uptick in this, and there was an incredible effort made at one point to really bring this down when Commissioner Hamburg was there and Commissioner Frieden as well.
Thanks, Donna. Finally, Ken Weinstein, extensive background in law enforcement and was a Homeland Security advisor in the White House.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. It was excellent. I wanted to focus on one of our recommendations in our national blueprint for biodefense, which
Yes, I
I
have.
assume you have in your nightstand at home, a bestseller. The very first recommendation is about coordination at the federal level. And just looking at your background as significant experience at the state level, the federal level, WHO, I can't think of anybody better to ask about that recommendation. Have you seen just over your years, or in particular in the aftermath of the Ebola outbreak and other crises, where there's a need for greater coordination, and to the extent that you have looked at our recommendation that there be an official in the White House, we recommend the vice president, and there be a council that would not only in the aftermath of crises, but sort of between crises, be thinking about these issues, planning for these issues, and working with state and locals and federal and overseas partners on these issues.
I think there needs to be a coordination. We've had at times in the White House, we've had leadership on the issues of health security, and then it dwindles off, and then it comes back, and then it dwindles off, and I think that what happens is that we get a little desensitized, and we don't realize that this is right around the corner again. It doesn't have to be, a terrorist attack. It could be what we've been speaking about, just a biological event, which is a natural event. I think coordination. Better coordination is always helpful. I think that we recognize that, and every time I've dealt with one of these outbreaks, we sit down and we work hard to make sure we have best coordination, both on a local level, but also across agencies. I find that in my experience with both Zika and Ebola, coordination with the CDC has been great, and also with calls to NIAID specifically on issues. The challenge is as you get further away from the U.S. and dealing with WHO is a little bit different. There's a different pace a little bit overseas, at least in my experience. And I think it's our job to obviously do everything we can to improve the coordination, and I work hard to do that on a regular basis, both with our federal partners, but also our regional partners, our neighboring states.
Let me give you a chance for a final summary statement by asking you why your last slide said "oi."
So I think it's because what I have experienced is that some of these outbreaks and problems really are incredibly time consuming. And what I have found is that once we start down the process of dealing with whether it was Zika or Ebola, literally it took so much time, and it takes time from everybody else, and there's so many other things that they also need to do, whether it's at the federal level, state level, city level, and we get so consumed by it, and it's just, boy, how are we going to get all of these things done at the same time? And my worry also, the other is that I just feel something is brewing. There'll be. When I walked into this job, I didn't think I was having an Ebola issue. I didn't think about Zika. And I do remember the first Zika information. It was in the Wall Street Journal. There was a little article. It was in the end of December, and it mentioned about what's happening in Brazil. And I ran up the flagpole and said, this is something that may be, headed our way. And we sat down. This was in December of 2015. And I just said to the team, let's come up with a plan. Let's start thinking about it. Of what we need to do, and the governor obviously jumped on it and said, let's get a 6-point plan. Let's do this quickly.
Thank you very much for your time, for what you contributed. We welcome any additional comments you have, and we'll take the liberty of asking you some more questions as time goes on.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. An honor.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, next panel on global security is Dr. James Lawler and Dr. Kenneth Luongo. I'm tempted to share with you an old joke, Dr. Zucker, that about